Friends, in this episode, I plan to talk about conflict management. In a way, it connects with negotiations, which we covered the last time. This time, I plan to make 4 points. First, how the nature of conflict has changed. That is to say, while all-out war has more or less ended with, say, the Vietnam War, which was finally resolved in 1975, there have been occasions of major warfare, the 2 Iraq wars. The conflict in Afghanistan also has gone through very grave, very hot moments. But we don't now see the kind of total warfare as in the past. Instead, we see conflicts which are localized, conflicts which last for a long time. I mean, take the Afghan situation. The Americans first moved into Afghanistan in 2002. We are now in 2020. There is still an American presence in Afghanistan. It is winding down. There is a kind of agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban, their main adversary, also supported by the Americans. But we can't absolutely be certain that the conflict has been resolved. So what happens today is old hostilities fester. Old problems persist over a longer period of time. Non-state actors have become major conflict proponents. There is ISIS in the Arab lands, has played a major role in the Syrian conflict, for example. Now, the Syrian conflict started as a kind of effort for a change of government. It was a domestic war in which external parties got involved, the Americans and later the Russians. And yet, on both sides of these external actors, there was a kind of self-restraint that also applied. So this just tells us the very complicated way in which conflicts now take place. And of course, the scale of human suffering has only grown. And the Syrian conflict is a classic example, but we see the same in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And then there are kind of hidden conflicts, quasi-conflicts, conflicts that go on in a kind of proxy fashion. My second major point is that there are now new and old issues. The old issues remain: questions of territory, questions of resources, question of sharing of joint assets like river waters. And then there are new types of issues that come up. For example, after an election, the incumbent leader, a president who has lost, refuses to vacate office, and that leads to conflict. We've seen that particularly in West Africa. But we've also seen in West Africa local effort by African states, by African leaders to try and resolve the conflict. So there are also similar new actions being taken by regional states, by small states, which kind of play a mediator role. If we look at how conflict can be avoided, one of the very best examples is offered by Brazil, which had an outstanding foreign minister. Rio Branco was the name by which he was known. Between the year 1902 and 1912, he settled and signed treaties covering all of the 13 states with which Brazil has a land frontier. It's one of the best examples of an action by a major state to forestall the eventuality of conflict over land borders. My third big point deals with the settlement process. How are conflicts managed in the sense of not just being contained, but ways in which countries work, different non-state actors work for the resolution of conflict or the limitation, the containment of conflict. There are many helpers. One of the major helpers has been, of course, the United Nations. But then the United Nations and its activities would require a full episode, maybe even a series of talks. And I will not get too much into the work of the United Nations over here, except to say that under the UN Charter, what is called Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, it has specific obligations to deal with conflict. The UN Security Council plays a role, but not always a very effective one. We see this right now with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The Security Council has appeared almost paralyzed in front of this. So, who are the other helpers? There are states like Norway, like Switzerland, like Austria, which play a role. Norway, in fact, has taken upon itself to play the role of a mediator in conflict and has done very well in helping to settle conflicts in Mali and in Guatemala. It also tried very, very hard in Sri Lanka. It did manage to contain the conflict. It did manage to start a process of conversations, of dialogue between the government of Sri Lanka and the LTTE, the Tamil separatist movement. But in the end, it was really the Sri Lanka government that imposed a military solution by virtually exterminating the dissident movement, the militants, the protagonists on the other side of the conflict in 2015. There are NGOs that play a role. The International Crisis Group, based in Brussels, with a sizable budget, has offices all over the world, and it plays a behind-the-scenes role. It doesn't rush in to claim credit every time publicly, but those who are in the know understand what they are doing. Norway hosts an annual conference of mediators of the peaceful settlement process, and that's a wonderful opportunity for different actors to try and share experiences, exchange methods that different parties have used in order to resolve conflict. The Vatican is a major helper in conflict resolution. There are many Christian agencies, and Indian religious leaders have also played a role, even in Central America. Sri Ravi Shankar has played a role, and this is acknowledged by many. So, how is conflict resolution handled? Zartman gave 3 ways in which a mediation process might work, where the mediator plays the role of a communicator between the two sides, assuming there are 2 protagonists, or plays the role as a formulator of possible solutions. And sometimes it takes on an even bigger role of a kind of manipulator, which pushes one or the other side in working for a settlement. But even before the mediation process starts, there is an even milder form of external assistance, and that is called good offices. We may also call it the role of a facilitator, where 1 or 2 states, or maybe more, maybe the UN Security Council, discusses with protagonists ways in which they might start a process of reconciliation. And I'll give you the example of the Kargil War between India and Pakistan in 1999. It lasted for about 2 months. Both sides decided that they would keep the conflict contained at the place where the conflict had burst out, and that was across the line of actual control, the ceasefire line in Kashmir between India and Pakistan. And while the conflict was going on, a shooting war in which aircraft were used, but the aircraft on both sides took care not to go across that line of control. So it was a hot conflict, but a limited conflict where self-restraint was applied by both sides. But the key point I want to make is that while it was on, major powers played a role behind the scenes with both New Delhi and Islamabad to persuade the two of them to start a process of direct dialogue, which led to a ceasefire. So that's an example of conflict management. There are other forms of conflict management. One is arbitration, where the two sides go to a third party and say, you tell us what is the best way in which we can come to a settlement. The International Court of Justice at The Hague also plays the role of a judge or an arbitrator in some conflicts in certain situations, because the ICJ cannot intervene in a conflict unless both sides have agreed to take the issue to the International Court. So it has jurisdiction when this is accepted by the states concerned. Then there are other methods. One of them is called coercive diplomacy. That is to say, when pressure is applied by an outside power, a third country, a group of countries, to push the one side or the other into a settlement. And this is particularly done in situations where there is internal conflict within a country between, say, a ruler or a regime that does not want to hand over power. There is an internal political movement, a dissident movement which wants change, and that leads to crisis. And we've seen this in Zimbabwe, we've seen this in a number of countries. There, the external powers might use the method of applying sanctions. Sometimes the sanctions have UN mandate, UN approval, UN endorsement, and sometimes they are simply imposed by major powers, particularly by Western powers. Sanctions work up to a point. Sometimes they actually harden resolve by the country facing sanctions that it will not give in to pressure. So now sanctions have taken many shapes. It is not only, say, limiting the supply of oil or some other vitally needed commodity, but also putting restrictions on travel by leaders of that regime under sanctions, freezing their bank accounts, and not issuing them with visas to be able to travel abroad. So these are some of the methods that are used. Finally, let me come to my fourth point, and this time I have 4 points: preventive diplomacy. It's a very seductive idea. Can diplomacy be applied in such a way as to prevent conflict? Far easier to say than actually do. At the United Nations, a concept was put forward called responsibility to protect. It consisted of 3 major principles. It's something that one should look up if this is of interest. Where the key point was that in some situations, external states will apply pressure in order to work for change in that country. When they feel that a particular regime is working against the interests, against the welfare, the well-being of its own people. The most obvious case, the most in-your-face example of this is Libya in 2011, where the methods of this responsibility to protect doctrine were used for regime change in Libya. Gaddafi, former president, was caught and was killed. But what was the result? What was the outcome? The outcome has been that in the last 9 years, Libya has seen endless conflict. One has to ask oneself, was the preceding regime of Gaddafi worse than the situation in which the people of Libya, the ordinary people of Libya, have found themselves due to prolonged civil war and chaos within the country? So while we've talked about all these things, we should also mention that there are processes within regions which are applied to kind of discuss issues before they become really serious. For example, the ASEAN countries have something called the Asian Regional Forum, which is simply a platform at which foreign ministers of some 25, 27 countries meet annually to discuss issues concerning that region. It is a place where ideas are exchanged, people, countries can let off steam and use the method of dialogue to ensure that problems don't grow into conflicts. Africa has applied this in its own way, in 2 or 3 ways. One is there is an OAU peacekeeping force which has actually intervened in situations in Sudan, in Somalia, in order to try and deal with shooting war and civil war within the countries. Not always with total success, but with limited success. In the same way that the UN peacekeeping forces are deployed, and currently the UN has some 15 situations where UN peacekeeping forces or peacekeepers are on the ground. So these are some of the processes that are used. In Africa, there has also been a process of working behind the scenes with governments to achieve a kind of de-escalation of problems within countries before they reach crisis point. This is called the peer review process, where quietly respected African leaders travel to countries and hold discussions with the leaders of countries where there is a potential for tension. An African businessman, somebody who made billions out of the information technology and communication revolution, has put aside a large sum of money for something called the Mo Ibrahim Prize, which goes to the African country, to the leader of the African country that has shown the best governance. It is an indirect way of ensuring that when elections take place, first to encourage the process of democratic elections within countries, and secondly, when elections take place, to ensure that leaders are willing to vacate office. This Ibrahim Prize is a sizable sum of money that's given $1 million each year for 5 years. It's a kind of incentive to leaders to vacate office, if we can put that a little bit plainly. So these are some of the methods that are used for conflict management. In the real world, complete settlement of conflict is relatively rare. What is much easier and what is more doable is to work to minimize conflict, to contain it, and to ensure that a shooting war becomes eventually no more than a domestic process of political resolution of issues. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this little presentation of mine, and if you enjoy it, do subscribe to the series and tell your friends about it. Thank you very much.